I'm dodging sandstorms in the Middle East when my phone pings with a message that makes my blood boil. The HOA is trying to kick my grandpa off his farm over his quirky fence made of old plow blades. Some woman named Pamela Dorsey hired fake security to smash it, slapped him with outrageous fines, and started spamming all the farmers with emails claiming his barn's nothing but hazardous junk. She thought calling the cops would seal her victory and get rid of the old man once and for all. Guess what I'm gonna do with her? And let me tell you, watching her dig her own grave was pure satisfaction. Stick around, cause you're gonna yell, "Serves her right" by the end of this story. And hey, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. The whole nightmare started 3 weeks ago when I was stationed at our forward operating base, dealing with the usual chaos of military life overseas. My phone buzzed during what should have been a quiet evening, and I saw Hazel Cooper's name on the screen. Hazel's been our neighbor for years, a single mom who works as an accountant and keeps to herself mostly, but she's always been good to Grandpa George. Her voice was shaking when she told me what was happening back home, and I could barely believe what I was hearing. Some woman named Pamela Dorsey, who apparently runs the local homeowners association like her own personal kingdom, had issued an eviction notice against my 75-year-old grandfather. The reason? His fence didn't meet their so-called rural aesthetic rules, whatever the hell that means. Grandpa George has lived on that farm for over 40 years, ever since he retired from his engineering job and decided to honor my grandmother's memory by keeping the land she loved so much. That fence Pamela was complaining about? It's made from old tractor parts and farm equipment that tells the story of decades of honest work. But to Pamela Dorsey, it was apparently an eyesore that needed to be eliminated so she could transform our rural community into some kind of suburban paradise that would boost property values and line her pockets. Sitting alone in the barracks with Hazel's shaky voice still in my head, I felt a guilt I hadn't known in combat. The guilt of not being there for the man who raised me. War made sense. This didn't. She was painting him as a hoarder, when in fact he's the most organized man I know. Every tool, every gear has a place. And that barn is a lifetime of sweat and stubborn pride. Every piece of equipment serves a purpose, and that barn represents decades of maintaining and improving the land that's been in our family since before I was born. The fact that this outsider was trying to destroy what my grandfather had built with his own hands made me angrier than any enemy fire I'd faced in combat. The eviction notice gave him 7 days to comply with a laundry list of demands that were clearly designed to be impossible to meet. Remove the fence, tear down parts of the barn, eliminate what they called agricultural clutter, and pay $5,000 in fines for violations he'd supposedly been committing for months. It was obviously a setup, a way to force him off his land so Pamela could swoop in with one of her developer friends and turn our family farm into another cookie-cutter subdivision. But she had seriously underestimated both my grandfather's stubborn streak and my determination to protect what's mine. Grandpa George's response to the eviction threat was absolutely perfect and exactly what I would have expected from the man who raised me. Instead of backing down or trying to negotiate with Pamela, he decided to build what he called his freedom fence, using even more tractor parts, old wagon wheels, and anything else he could find that would make his property look even more authentically rural. He was essentially giving Pamela and her HOA the middle finger in the most creative way possible, and I couldn't have been prouder of him if I'd tried. The man who taught me to stand up for what's right was showing that age hadn't dimmed his fighting spirit one bit. But Pamela wasn't content to let this become a battle of wills. According to Hazel, she escalated things by hiring some kind of private security patrol to come onto Grandpa's property and tear down his fence without permission. These weren't real police officers, just thugs in uniforms who thought they could intimidate an old man into submission. Hazel managed to film the whole thing from her kitchen window, and when she sent me that video, I nearly put my fist through the wall of my barrack. Watching those men destroy my grandfather's work while he stood there helpless and alone was more than I could take. I immediately requested emergency leave, which thankfully was approved without too many questions. My commanding officer could see that this was a family emergency that needed my personal attention, and within hours, I was on a transport plane heading back to the States. During that long flight home, I kept replaying Hazel's video and thinking about all the ways I was going to make Pamela Dorsey regret the day she decided to mess with my family. She might think she's dealing with some helpless old farmer, but she's about to learn that this particular farmer raised an Army lieutenant who doesn't back down from a fight. As my plane was landing at the airport, my phone buzzed with another text from Hazel that made my heart race. Pamela was holding some kind of secret meeting that very night to discuss seizing Grandpa's farm through eminent domain or some other legal manipulation. She was moving fast, probably hoping to get everything wrapped up before I could make it home to interfere with her plans. Little did she know that her rush to close the deal was about to become her biggest mistake, because I was already on my way and I had no intention of playing by her rules. The first thing I saw when I pulled into our driveway was Grandpa George's latest masterpiece, and I had to laugh despite everything that was happening. His new Liberty Rig fence was even more spectacular than I'd imagined. A glorious collection of old shovels, wagon wheels, rusted farm equipment, and hand-painted signs declaring things like, "Freedom isn't free," and "This land is our land." It looked like the most patriotic scrapyard in America, and every inch of it was a deliberate thumb in the eye to Pamela Dorsey and her ridiculous aesthetic standards. The old man was standing next to his creation wearing his favorite canvas hat and a grin that told me he was having the time of his life fighting this battle. But even as I was admiring Grandpa's handiwork, I could see evidence of Pamela's campaign against him scattered around the neighborhood. She'd plastered photos of our farm all over the community bulletin board at the local general store, with captions asking, "Is this your countryside view?" and "Do you want this eyesore representing our community?" She was trying to turn our neighbors against us by making Grandpa look like some kind of crazy hermit who was destroying property values for everyone else. The manipulation was so obvious it made me sick, but I could see how it might work on people who didn't know the real story behind her sudden interest in rural aesthetics. I was still looking around and getting my bearings when Pamela herself showed up, right on schedule like she'd been watching for my arrival. Pamela, the Florida real estate flunky in an SUV that probably cost more than our barn, strutted out like she owned the whole county. Word around town was she'd lost big in some Florida real estate bust, moved here with fresh veneers and a plan to never feel small again. Maybe this town was her second shot, and Grandpa was in the way. She marched up to Grandpa like she owned the place and started demanding that he remove his Liberty Rig immediately, threatening to call the police if he didn't comply within the hour. Grandpa, bless his heart, kept mishearing her name and calling her Patty, which only made her more furious. The confrontation escalated quickly when Pamela pulled out a stack of papers and announced that she was fining Grandpa $5,000 for what she called rural blight and destruction of community standards. She was waving those papers around like they were some kind of holy writ, explaining in her most condescending voice how the HOA had the legal authority to enforce aesthetic standards even on agricultural properties. Grandpa listened to her whole speech with a straight face, nodded thoughtfully, and then calmly walked over to a box he'd hidden behind the barn. What happened next was pure George Barnes magic. He pulled out a collection of small fireworks left over from the 4th of July and started setting them off one by one, each explosion accompanied by him shouting something about HOA freedom and the rights of property owners. Then he grabbed handfuls of red hay he'd been saving for some unknown purpose and scattered it all across the front yard while dancing around like some kind of elderly revolutionary. The whole performance was so unexpected and joyful that even some of the neighbors who'd been keeping their distance started coming out to watch and laugh. Pamela stood there with her mouth hanging open, clearly having no idea how to respond to this level of creative resistance. But the situation took a darker turn when Pamela's private security patrol showed up, apparently summoned by some kind of signal she'd given them. These were the same thugs who'd torn down Grandpa's fence before, and they obviously thought they could intimidate him into submission through physical presence and veiled threats. One of them actually had the nerve to put his hands on my grandfather, giving him a shove that sent the old man stumbling backward toward his precious Liberty Rig. That's when something snapped inside me, and I stepped forward with the kind of controlled fury that had served me well in combat situations. I didn't say a word at first, just moved between Grandpa and the security guy with my eyes locked on his face, letting him see exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. My army training had taught me how to project authority without raising my voice, and I could see the uncertainty creeping into his expression as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as pushing around an old man. I helped Grandpa to his feet while keeping my attention focused on the security team, making it clear that any further aggression would be met with appropriate response. Pamela was watching this whole exchange with growing alarm, probably realizing for the first time that her simple intimidation tactics weren't going to work anymore. While I was dealing with the immediate threat, Hazel appeared at my elbow and quietly told me she'd been doing some detective work of her own. She'd managed to save some text messages where Pamela had been bragging to her friends about a cash deal she'd arranged with some developer. Messages that made it clear this whole HOA enforcement action was really about personal profit rather than community standards. But Hazel also warned me that Pamela was trying to destroy evidence of her real motives, probably anticipating that someone might eventually challenge her authority. The race was on to expose her scheme before she could cover her tracks completely. After her security team failed to intimidate us, Pamela tried a different approach, suddenly switching to her most reasonable voice and explaining how she was only trying to help the community maintain its property values. She claimed that investors were interested in the area but were being scared away by properties that didn't meet modern standards, and that she was actually doing Grandpa a favor by encouraging him to upgrade his facility. The whole performance was so transparently fake that I almost laughed, but I could see how someone who didn't know her real agenda might be fooled by her apparent concern for the neighborhood's welfare. As Pamela and her goons finally left, she turned back with a smirk that told me this was far from over. She clearly thought she held all the cards and that a small-town HOA president could outmaneuver an army lieutenant through superior knowledge of local politics and legal procedures. But Hazel whispered something that gave me hope for the first time since I'd arrived home. She had those text messages that proved Pamela's real motives, but more importantly, she suspected that Pamela was planning to destroy evidence of her dirty dealing before anyone could use it against her. The question now was whether we could move fast enough to stop her. Hazel invited me over to her kitchen table that evening and showed me the evidence she'd been collecting. And what I saw made everything crystal clear. The text messages were damning, showing Pamela bragging to her friends about a lucrative cash deal she'd arranged with some developer named Marcus who wanted to build luxury homes on rural properties. She'd written things like, "Finally found a way to get that stubborn old farmer off his land," and "Once I clear out the agricultural eyesores, Marcus says he'll pay me a 20% commission on every lot he develops." It wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about Pamela using her HOA position to force people off their land so she could profit from the sale to developers. Even more disturbing were the messages where she talked about her strategy for getting rid of what she called problem properties. She'd been systematically targeting older residents and farmers who couldn't afford to fight legal battles, using bogus violations and excessive fines to force them into bankruptcy or foreclosure. Grandpa wasn't her first victim, just her latest, and she'd apparently been perfecting this scheme for months while flying under the radar of local authorities. The woman was running what amounted to a rural gentrification scam, and she'd gotten away with it because most of her victims were too isolated or intimidated to fight back effectively. As I looked through the screenshots, Hazel's fingers trembled. "My husband, he built that barn with George," she said, voice cracking. "Watching it fall apart piece by piece, I just couldn't sit quiet anymore." I decided the best approach was to confront Pamela directly at the next HOA meeting and expose her scheme in front of the entire community. But she must have suspected that someone was onto her, because the very next day she launched a coordinated smear campaign against me. They pasted my military photo under headlines like "Unstable and Trained to Kill." It stung, not just the lie, but how fast fear makes neighbors forget decades of friendship. Simultaneously, she announced that she'd discovered Grandpa owed $10,000 in back HOA fees and penalties that had supposedly been accumulating for years, producing official-looking documents that detailed violations and fines, though I noticed immediately that some signatures looked suspicious and dates didn't match actual property improvements. The effect of Pamela's propaganda campaign was immediate and depressing. Neighbors who'd known Grandpa for decades started avoiding him at the general store, and several farmers told Hazel they couldn't afford to get involved in anything that might bring HOA scrutiny to their own properties. People were scared, and Pamela was using that fear to isolate us from potential allies who might otherwise have been willing to stand up for what was right. She was turning our own community against us through a combination of lies, legal intimidation, and economic pressure. I knew I needed help from someone with actual authority, so I took Hazel's evidence to Sheriff Clay Reynolds, a man I'd heard good things about from other veterans in the area. Clay turned out to be a former soldier himself, and when I explained the situation and showed him the text messages, his expression grew darker with every detail. He told me he'd had his suspicions about Pamela for a while, especially after several elderly residents had come to him with complaints about HOA harassment, but he hadn't been able to prove anything concrete until now. The text messages were exactly the kind of evidence he needed to start a real investigation. Clay's reaction gave me hope, but Pamela was moving faster than I'd anticipated. She called an emergency HOA meeting for the following evening, claiming she had urgent business regarding the George Barnes property that couldn't wait for the regular monthly meeting. According to the official notice, she was going to present final evidence of Grandpa's violations and call for an immediate vote to begin foreclosure proceedings. She was trying to ram through her land grab before anyone could organize effective opposition or examine her evidence too closely. That night, as I sat on Grandpa's porch looking out at his Liberty Rig fence silhouetted against the sunset, I felt a wave of doubt wash over me. Maybe I was in over my head, trying to fight someone who knew the local system better than I did and had more resources at her disposal. If Pamela had managed to turn half the community against us, she had official-looking paperwork to back up her claims, and she clearly had connections with developers who could afford to fight legal battles that would bankrupt ordinary farmers. I found myself staring at an old photo of Grandpa and Grandma that he kept on the porch table, wondering if I was about to lose the last piece of her memory that he had left. But just as I was starting to spiral into despair, my phone rang with a call from Clay that changed everything. His voice was excited as he told me that the text messages had checked out under forensic analysis, proving they were genuine communications from Pamela's phone. Even better, he had been conducting his own surveillance of Pamela's house and had managed to capture video footage of her meeting with the developer Marcus, including what appeared to be an exchange of cash for documents. The evidence was building into a case that could not only save Grandpa's farm, but also expose Pamela's entire corruption scheme to the whole community. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of bullhorns and angry shouting coming from our front yard, and when I looked out the window, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Pamela had organized what she was calling a community protest, complete with professionally made signs reading "No soldiers, just farms," and "Veterans need treatment, not special rights." She'd somehow convinced about a dozen people to show up and march around our property, and she was leading them with a megaphone, giving a speech about how dangerous veterans were destroying the peaceful rural lifestyle that families had moved here to enjoy. The whole performance was so over the top that it would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. Pamela was fake crying into her megaphone about how Grandpa's rabid livestock posed a threat to children, even though the closest thing we have to livestock is a couple of barn cats who spend most of their time sleeping in the hay. She was describing our farm as a potential terrorist training ground. One protester held a sign reading, "Down with tractors, up with HOA harmony." I wasn't sure if he was serious or just confused by the free donuts Pamela handed out. The lies were so ridiculous that I couldn't understand how anyone was taking her seriously. But the sad truth was that fear makes people believe crazy things. What really pushed me over the edge was when she started describing Grandpa as a senile old man who was being manipulated by his violent grandson into resisting legitimate legal authority. She was painting herself as some kind of heroic figure who was trying to protect the community from our dangerous influence, when in reality, she was the one threatening people's homes and livelihoods for personal profit. I watched her performance from the kitchen window, feeling my anger build with every lie she told, but I forced myself to stay calm and think strategically about how to respond. The situation escalated when Pamela's lawyer showed up, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who started serving legal papers to anyone who'd listen. He was claiming that Grandpa's property represented a public nuisance that posed immediate danger to the community, and that emergency measures were needed to protect innocent families from our reckless behavior. The paperwork looked official and intimidating, full of legal language that most people wouldn't understand, but I could see it was just another attempt to use the legal system to frighten people into compliance. Things reached a breaking point when Pamela decided to accuse me of assault, claiming that I'd threatened her security team and put my hands on her during our previous confrontation. She called 911 right there in front of everyone, sobbing into her phone about how she was being terrorized by a dangerous veteran who couldn't control his violent impulses. It was pure theater, but it was effective theater, and I could see some of the protesters starting to look at me like I really might be dangerous. The woman was a master manipulator, and she was using every trick in the book to destroy my credibility. When Sheriff Clay arrived to investigate Pamela's assault claims, I held my breath, wondering if he'd been fooled by her performance or pressured by her political connections to take her side. But the moment he stepped out of his patrol car and saw me standing there in my crisp army uniform, something changed in his demeanor. He walked over and shook my hand like we were old friends, asked about my service with genuine respect, and then turned to Pamela with obvious skepticism. Her complaint suddenly didn't seem quite as credible when it was coming from someone who was obviously running a propaganda campaign against a decorated veteran. Clay interviewed witnesses and examined the supposed evidence of my violent behavior, but everything fell apart under scrutiny. The security guard's stories didn't match up. Pamela couldn't explain why she'd waited so long to report an alleged assault, and several neighbors admitted they hadn't actually seen me do anything threatening. More importantly, Clay had his own evidence about Pamela's motives and methods, and he wasn't about to let her use false accusations to cover up her real crime. The whole assault complaint was obviously a desperate attempt to discredit me before I could expose her corruption. That night I decided it was time to take the fight directly to the community and let people know what was really happening. I spent hours writing anonymous letters that laid out the facts about Pamela's scheme, including details from the text messages and Clay's investigation. I explained how she was using the HOA to force people off their land for personal profit, how she'd been targeting elderly residents who couldn't fight back, and how her sudden interest in rural aesthetics was really about clearing the way for luxury development. Then, I drove around town in the middle of the night, slipping those letters into mailboxes and hoping that at least some people would read them with an open mind. Like the letters called for people to attend the emergency HOA meeting and demand answers about Pamela's real agenda. I challenged everyone to ask themselves why she was so desperate to remove one old farmer's fence that she'd hire security guards and stage protests, and whether they really believed that aesthetic standards were worth destroying someone's family legacy. Most importantly, I warned them that if Pamela could do this to Grandpa George, she could do it to any of them whenever it suited her financial interests. The question was whether our community would stand up for what was right or let fear and intimidation win the day. As I finished distributing the letters and headed home, I felt a mixture of hope and dread about what would happen next. The emergency HOA meeting was tomorrow night, and it would either be Pamela's moment of triumph or the beginning of her downfall. She was clearly planning something big, probably hoping to use her fake evidence and legal intimidation to ram through the foreclosure before anyone could organize effective opposition. But I was ready for whatever she had planned, and I had a feeling that Sheriff Clay was going to play a bigger role in tomorrow's events than Pamela was expecting. The community barn was packed that evening with more people than I'd seen at any local gathering in years, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Farmers who rarely left their properties had driven in from miles around. Elderly residents were clustered in worried groups near the front, and even some younger families had shown up to see what all the drama was about. Pamela had set up at the front of the room like she was holding court, surrounded by her official paperwork and flanked by her lawyer and a couple of board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She was wearing her most professional outfit and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who thought victory was assured. I positioned myself toward the back of the room where I could see everything, with Hazel beside me and Grandpa George sitting proudly in his cleanest flannel shirt and that old canvas hat he loved. Several people were filming the meeting on their phones, and I could see Pamela wasn't entirely comfortable with that level of documentation, though she was trying to maintain her composed facade. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as people speculated about what was going to happen, and I noticed that opinions seemed pretty evenly split between those who supported Pamela's version of events and those who'd read my anonymous letters and were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Pamela called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a presentation about property values and community standards that was clearly designed to make her seem like a reasonable public servant rather than a corrupt profiteer. She had charts showing how agricultural eyesores depressed home values and testimonials from residents who supposedly supported her modernization efforts. As she clicked through her graphs, I looked around the room. Not a single eye on the screen. People weren't here for stats, they were here for truth, and it was about to drop like a hammer. It was a slick performance that might have been convincing if you didn't know what was really behind her sudden passion for aesthetic improvement. When she finally got to the specifics of Grandpa's case, Pamela displayed Grandpa's Liberty rig like it was a war crime. Fire hazard? Sure. Freedom hazard? Definitely. She claimed that multiple neighbors had complained about the smell from his barn, the noise from his occasional fireworks displays, and the dangerous condition of his agricultural equipment. Then she dropped her bombshell, announcing that her investigation had revealed $10,000 in unpaid HOA fees and penalties that gave them legal grounds for immediate foreclosure proceedings. That's when I stood up and asked permission to address the meeting, which Pamela couldn't refuse without looking like she was trying to suppress opposition. I walked to the front of the room and calmly explained that I'd been investigating Pamela's claims and had discovered some interesting discrepancies in her paperwork. Then I pulled out copies of Hazel's text messages and started reading them aloud, including Pamela's bragging about her cash deal with the developer and her strategy for removing problem properties. The room went dead silent as people realized they were hearing evidence of corruption from the horse's mouth. Pamela tried to interrupt, claiming the messages were forgeries and demanding to know where I had gotten private communications. But I just kept reading. The text where she described Grandpa as a stubborn old farmer who needed to be cleared out was particularly damning, as was her celebration about finding a way to profit from rural gentrification. When I finished reading, I asked the crowd whether they really believed this was about community standards or whether it looked more like a scheme to steal people's land for personal gain. The murmur of angry voices told me that at least some people were starting to see through her lies. Then, Hazel stood up and delivered the most powerful moment of the entire evening. In a voice that shook with emotion, she described how Pamela had forced her to sell her late husband's tractor by claiming it was improperly parked on her own property. She explained how the HOA president had used threats and intimidation to make her feel like a criminal for trying to maintain the farm equipment that represented her family's livelihood. When she finished speaking, several other people raised their hands to share similar stories of harassment and bogus violations that they'd been too afraid to discuss before. Pamela was clearly losing control of the situation, and that's when she made her biggest mistake. Instead of trying to defend herself rationally, she stood up and started shouting threats at the crowd, warning that anyone who supported my version of events would face increased HOA fees and enhanced scrutiny of their properties. She was essentially admitting that she used her position to punish people who opposed her, which was exactly the kind of abuse of power that would turn even her supporters against her. The room erupted in angry voices as people realized they'd been living under the thumb of a petty tyrant. Sheriff Clay had been standing quietly near the back wall, but when Pamela started making threats, he stepped forward and asked permission to address the meeting. He explained that he'd been investigating complaints about HOA harassment for several months, and that the text messages I'd presented were part of an ongoing criminal investigation into corruption and abuse of office. Then he announced that he had additional evidence, including video footage of cash changing hands between Pamela and her developer friend, that would be presented to the district attorney for possible prosecution. The climax came when Hazel connected her phone to the barn's old projection system and displayed the video Clay had captured on the wall for everyone to see. There was Pamela, clear as day, accepting an envelope full of cash from a man in an expensive suit, while handing over what appeared to be official HOA documents. The crowd gasped as they watched their trusted community leader taking bribes to facilitate land deals, and Pamela's face went white as she realized her secret meetings hadn't been as secret as she'd thought. In desperation, she tried to run for the exit, but in her panic, she tripped over a hay bale and went sprawling across the barn floor. As Pamela scrambled to her feet and fled toward her car, she screamed back at the crowd that she'd find a way to destroy everyone who'd opposed her, starting with my grandfather's farm. It was the final proof that this had never been about community standards or legal violations, but about power and revenge against anyone who dared to resist her authority. The meeting dissolved into chaos as people demanded her immediate resignation and called for a complete investigation of every decision she'd made as HOA president. I felt a surge of triumph, but I also knew that Pamela wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and her threat suggested she still had cards left to play. The next morning brought what I thought would be the final confrontation, but Pamela had one last desperate card to play that caught me completely off guard. She showed up at our farm with a bandaged hand and a story about how I'd violently assaulted her the night before, claiming that I'd grabbed her and shoved her into the fence post when she tried to leave the meeting. The injury looked real enough, complete with bruises and scrapes that would photograph well for her inevitable lawsuit, and she was acting like a traumatized victim who'd barely escaped with her life. She'd brought along a local news reporter she'd somehow convinced to cover her story, and they were setting up for what was obviously going to be a hit piece about the dangerous veteran who was terrorizing innocent community members. Pamela was giving an interview right there in our driveway, sobbing about how she'd only been trying to help the community maintain its standards when she was brutally attacked by someone who couldn't control his violent impulses. I'd rehearsed this exact scenario the night before. Every manipulator has a tell, hers was overacting. All I had to do was press play. It was a masterful performance that would have been convincing if I hadn't known she was capable of injuring herself to frame me. But what Pamela didn't know was that Sheriff Clay had installed security cameras around our property after her previous threats, and those cameras had captured everything that happened the night before. When she called 911 to report the alleged assault, Clay arrived with video evidence showing exactly how she'd gotten her injuries. The footage clearly showed her deliberately banging her own hand against the fence post after everyone else had left, practicing her victim routine before heading home to plan her media strategy. Even more damning was the audio recording I'd secretly made during the confrontation. Before she arrived that morning, I'd hidden a small recorder in the barn lantern where we keep our emergency supplies, suspecting that she might try something desperate now that her corruption had been exposed. The device captured her confessing to the reporter about her land deal with the developer, bragging about how she'd manipulated the HOA rules to force out undesirable residents, and admitting that the whole rural aesthetics campaign was designed to clear the way for luxury development. When Clay played the recording for the gathered crowd, Pamela's reaction was everything I could have hoped for. She started shrieking about illegal surveillance and violation of her privacy rights, apparently forgetting that she was standing on private property where we had every right to record conversations. Then she made the mistake of turning on the people who'd believed her lies, screaming that they were just ignorant peasants who didn't understand real estate law or property development. It was the kind of elitist rant that revealed her true contempt for the community she'd claimed to be serving. The reporter, who'd initially seemed sympathetic to Pamela's victim story, quickly realized he'd been played and started asking much harder questions about her financial arrangements with developers and her use of HOA authority for personal gain. When Pamela couldn't provide satisfactory answers and kept changing her story about how she'd been injured, he packed up his equipment and left without filming the puff piece she'd been counting on. Her last chance to control the narrative had just evaporated, and she was facing the reality that her crimes were about to become public knowledge. Clay moved quickly to arrest Pamela on charges of fraud, filing false police reports, and abuse of office. But she wasn't going down quietly. As he was reading her rights, she started screaming about how she'd already sold Grandpa's land and that it was too late to stop the development project. According to her rant, she'd forged his signature on sale documents and had already received a significant down payment from the developer, meaning that even if she went to jail, we'd still lose the farm through her fraudulent transaction. For a moment, my heart sank as I realized that Pamela might have found a way to win, even in defeat. If she'd really managed to forge legal documents and complete a fraudulent sale, it could take years of expensive litigation to undo the damage, and we might not have the resources to fight a well-funded development company in court. But then I remembered the recording I'd made, and specifically her confession about manipulating documents and forging signatures. That recording wasn't just evidence of her corruption, it was proof that any sale she'd arranged was completely fraudulent and legally invalid. Clay confirmed that the recording would be more than enough to void any fraudulent transaction, and that the developer would face his own legal troubles for participating in what was obviously a corrupt land grab. Pamela's attempt to steal Grandpa's farm through forged documents had just become additional evidence in a criminal conspiracy case that would probably send several people to prison. Her desperate last-ditch effort to salvage something from her scheme had actually made things worse for everyone involved in the plot. As the handcuffs clicked into place and Clay led Pamela toward his patrol car, she turned back for one final threat, screaming that she had powerful friends who would make sure I regretted crossing her. But her voice cracked as she spoke, and I could see the defeat in her eyes as she realized that her reign of terror over our community was finally over. The woman who'd thought she could use fear and intimidation to steal people's homes was about to learn what it felt like to be powerless and afraid. The aftermath of Pamela's arrest moved faster than I'd expected, with news of her corruption scheme spreading throughout the county and prompting investigations into several other suspicious HOA activities in neighboring communities. The district attorney announced that she was facing multiple felony charges, including fraud, extortion, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Her developer friend Marcus was also arrested when investigators discovered that their scheme had targeted at least 6 other properties besides Grandpa's farm, making this a major criminal conspiracy rather than an isolated incident. The fake sale documents that Pamela had been bragging about turned out to be worthless forgeries that wouldn't have held up in court for 5 minutes, but they provided additional evidence of her criminal intent and helped prosecutors build a stronger case. My recording of her confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's evidence, clearly establishing her motive and methods while destroying any possibility that she could claim innocence or blame her actions on misunderstanding HOA rules. The woman who thought she was above the law was about to face serious prison time for her crimes. 3 days after Pamela's arrest, our community organized a celebration at the same barn where she'd tried to railroad Grandpa out of his home, and it felt like the whole county showed up to show their support. People brought food, music, and stories about their own encounters with HOA harassment, creating an atmosphere of solidarity and relief that reminded me why small communities can be so special when they come together for the right reason. Grandpa George was the guest of honor, wearing his best shirt and grinning like he'd won the lottery as neighbors lined up to shake his hand and apologize for ever doubting him. The most meaningful moment came when Sheriff Clay arrived in his dress uniform, accompanied by 2 other officers who'd served overseas and wanted to show their respect for a fellow veteran. Clay had organized what he called a recognition ceremony to acknowledge my service and my efforts to protect our community from corruption. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. As I stood there in my crisp Army uniform, feeling proud but slightly embarrassed by all the attention, Clay gave a signal and all 3 officers snapped to attention and rendered a formal military salute that lasted a full 30 seconds. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the crowd, especially Pamela, who was watching from the back seat of a patrol car as she was being transported to her arraignment. The same cops she'd called to intimidate my grandfather were now showing respect for the veteran she'd tried to portray as dangerous and unstable. Her expression of shock and defeat was visible even from across the barn, and I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her last memory of our community would be the sight of law enforcement honoring the man she'd tried to destroy. After the formal ceremony, Grandpa George took the stage and gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. He talked about how the farm represented more than just land and buildings. It was a connection to my grandmother's memory and a legacy he wanted to preserve for future generations. He thanked everyone who'd stood up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to stay silent and hope the trouble would pass them by. Then he pointed to his Liberty Rig fence and said something that captured everything we'd been fighting for. This fence, it's not just mine, it's yours too. Every bolt, every wheel, built by hands that refuse to be pushed out. Just like this town. The crowd erupted in cheers, and I knew our victory meant something bigger than just saving one farm. The celebration continued into the evening, with people sharing stories, making plans for positive changes to the HOA structure, and generally enjoying the kind of community fellowship that Pamela's reign of terror had nearly destroyed. I found myself talking with neighbors I'd never met before, learning about their own experiences with harassment and intimidation, and feeling grateful for the reminder that most people are fundamentally decent when they're not being manipulated by fear and lies. This was what small-town America was supposed to feel like, and it had taken exposing a criminal conspiracy to bring us back together. As the crowd began to thin out and people headed home to their families, I stood with Grandpa George, looking out at his beloved Liberty Rig fence, now illuminated by strings of lights that someone had donated for the celebration. He pulled out a small box of leftover fireworks and set them off one by one, each explosion lighting up the rural landscape and echoing across the fields like a declaration of freedom. The old man, who'd refused to be intimidated by threats and legal papers, was celebrating his victory in the most appropriate way possible. The legal proceedings continued for several more months, but the outcome was never in doubt once prosecutors presented the evidence we'd gathered. Pamela received a sentence of 5 years in prison for her various crimes, while Marcus, the developer, got 3 years and was forced to pay substantial restitution to his victims. The HOA structure was completely reformed, with new oversight mechanisms and term limits that would prevent any future president from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that had enabled Pamela's crimes. As for me, I returned to my duties overseas with a renewed appreciation for what I was fighting to protect. The experience had reminded me that threats to freedom don't always come from foreign enemies. Sometimes they come from people who abuse positions of trust and authority to prey on their own neighbors. But it had also shown me that communities can defend themselves when good people find the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against them. Before I left, Grandpa George and I worked together to expand his Liberty Rig fence into an even more spectacular display of rural creativity and patriotic spirit. We added new sections made from Pamela's confiscated campaign materials, along with hand-painted signs telling the story of how our community had fought back against corruption and won. Every piece of that fence now represents not just agricultural heritage, but the victory of honest people over those who tried to steal their homes and destroy their way of life. If you've ever dealt with an HOA tyrant like Pamela Dorsey, drop a comment below and tell us how you fought back. And if you happen to be someone who thinks you can use your little bit of authority to intimidate and steal from your neighbors, well, good luck with that. Because there are a lot more people like Grandpa George and me out there than you might think. And we don't back down when family and community are on the line. Never mess with an old farmer who raised a soldier. And never underestimate the power of good people working together to expose corruption and protect what matters most.